You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. If you've been listening to this program for a while, you'll know from time to time I ask you to look at a map to help put an episode in context. Because we're going to talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo, among other places. Maybe when you were in school it was still Zaire. Yep, pull out your map. I can wait a second. Depending on what projection of the big round earth you're using, Africa may be shrunk, and Greenland and Canada huge. Some maps make the global south look too small. But DR Congo, right there in the heart of Africa, is enormous, slightly bigger than the United States east of the Mississippi. Not only huge, but chock full of resources, and because of its size, bordering a large number of other countries, to which it sometimes exports instability and conflict. And for most of its history as a place, it's been badly run, really badly run. And now is once again a trouble spot in the heart of Africa. The most recent trouble came in mid-May, when Congo's army foiled a coup in the presidential palace in the capital city, Kinshasa. The attempt was organized by self-exiled opposition figure Christian Malanga, and the attacks may have been doomed from the start.
You saw an outsider coming with a few Americans, and, of course, there were Congolese involved, but you have to have buy-in from somebody.
That's Vox reporter Ioanes. She says the attempted coup was both unusual and ineffective because Malanga and his American co-conspirators lacked military support and some other essential components for a government takeover.
If you are going to mount a successful coup, especially a military coup, you have to be pretty intimately knowledgeable about, where the president's going to be, where people in power are going to be. And it's not at the presidential palace because of security concerns.
The failed attack is the latest example of what some social scientists are calling a coup contagion. Since 2021, there's been more than half a dozen attempts in the coup belt of Africa, an area stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. What's going on with this recent spate of violence, and how are China, Russia, and the U.S. adding to regional instability? Ioanes covers global and general assignment news as the world and weekend reporter at Vox. She's been reporting on U.S. politics and policy and foreign affairs since 2021, covering Russia's war with Ukraine, U.S. congressional policy, and most recently, the war in Gaza. Ellen, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, the world's been focused on Ukraine and Gaza, understandably. But in the background, there's been a spike in coups in Africa. What's been going on in Africa that really demands an American's attention?
Africa, as you were saying, is a huge continent, and it's hugely diverse, and there are lots of different kinds of political instability in different countries. And I think what you were referring to was the sort of coup belt, as some people like to call it, across the Sahel region, which is basically the slightly northern part of Africa, like right above the Sahara, that runs from east to west. And so that includes countries like Niger, Burkina Faso. Starting in about 2021, there have been a series of military coups in those countries, and that extends in countries all the way across to Sudan.
Now, just a blink of an eye ago, we were, as a world, exulting and celebrating the fact that more and more places had elected governments, and that included the 50-plus countries in Africa. More of them had elected governments after a post-colonial period of coups and strongmen and dictatorships. And now, oh, great, all these people were electing governments. What happened? It's almost like you went to sleep like Rip Van Winkle And then you woke up and you realized the world hadn't changed that much because China, Russia, and the United States were suddenly vying for influence in Africa again. It was like a 1960s time warp.
Right. You do sort of see what I would call a neocolonialism and also state capture in the region. State capture is when either an internal or an external body or group comes in and takes over, that there might be an indigenous leader in charge, but basically that person is indebted to or beholden to these external elements or these particular elements that are not elected, not governmental, and they are extracting resources. Like particularly what we see in this sort of coup belt is mining resources, gold, diamonds, but also these precious other kinds of metals and elements that are important for, cell phone, things like cobalt and things like that. So you do see a lot of Russian influence in that region, and particularly the Wagner Group has gotten itself involved in many of these countries where they've made security deals with these coup leaders, and who, of course, are not elected, but they are indigenous. They were part of the militaries. They're citizens of the countries that they're in charge of nominally. So they make these deals with Wagner for protection because there is a lot of instability. There's a lot of violence, but the violence has increased. It hasn't decreased in these places. But because the government is beholden to these other mercenary forces, they're able to take economic advantage too.
People who have been paying attention, they hear the Wagner Group and they think, oh, yeah, I remember when that guy came to his accidental end and his plane fell out of the sky, Prigozhin. That wasn't the end of the Wagner Group, was it? They're still in business.
Yeah, definitely. And so they've been subsumed much more into the Russian military, which is really why Prigozhin led that march on Moscow before his untimely demise, let's say. So that was really the argument. He wanted to operate more independently. And there was an insistence that this group, which had always been funded by the Russian government, would be much more integrated into the military, which Prigozhin really didn't want.
But Wagner still kind of does the dirty work, the non-state work for Putin and the Russian government.
Yeah, you could say that.
So do they actually guard mines and the roads that lead from the mines to the ports and the railroads? Like, what are they up to?
In Western African countries, the reason that there have been agreements with the Wagner Group is to provide security and to fight off Islamic State offshoots and these sort of violent elements. It's really like security of the people, but that doesn't really happen at all. Like in Mali, a couple of years ago, there was allegedly a massacre of civilians that the Wagner Group helped perpetrate. So they don't really do that much to actually protect these citizens. It's more like they have this very violent, secure reputation. And I'm sure there's other stuff going on where these leaders are perhaps pressured or incentivized in some way to take on the Wagner Group to help them fight off whatever security threats they have. But again, that's not effective in actually diminishing the security threat. You can see in these countries that actually civilian deaths go up under these coup situations and in places where Wagner and the mercenary groups are involved.
Is there a different MO, broadly speaking, when you look at the Chinese and their heavy involvement in Africa? And as you were just talking about, the Wagner Group as a sort of quasi-state arm of the Russian government and their heavy involvement, certainly in some very unstable parts of Sahel Africa. And look at the U.S., which has seemed to have lost a couple of encounters lately. Is the way our governments, these three big governments, are involved in Africa different, similar? What are they up to?
There are a couple of different dynamics going on. First of all, the United States has a poor reputation in the global South because It has fomented coups in different countries. And the United States is also really friendly and allies with the actual colonizers in these countries, like France in particular. There's a lot of anti-French sentiment in some of these Francophone countries, Niger, Mali, where the French used to occupy. And post-liberation, a lot of the U.S. presence has been military. So there are all these different dynamics that leaves people looking at the U.S. involvement there askance.
Well, the Chinese and Russian ambassadors aren't ever going to give you a problem about not holding elections either.
Nope, absolutely not. And our track record on that is complicated too. Somebody told me a few months ago when I was doing an interview, like, the United States is fine if you hold elections and your president is wearing a suit rather than a military uniform. Other than that, it doesn't go that much deeper, right? Like, we'll say, great, you held elections, they were reasonably free and fair. It doesn't matter, actually, if this person who has been elected is interested in democracy, interested in economic development, all of these things that actually are meaningful for the people that live there. It's very appearance-centric rather than making sure that there is real development and real change, especially in these transitional countries.
Well, unlike Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, the Democratic Republic of Congo is not a former British or French colony. It's a former Belgian colony, and the Belgians were pretty bad colonialists. The Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the star pupils of the problems of colonialism. In the peculiarity of the late 19th century scramble for Africa, instead of Belgium owning what was known as the Belgian Congo, by a quirk of legalism, the king of Belgium was the owner of the Congo. He was, in effect, the world's largest landowner and gave Belgian corporations free rein across this vast territory to abuse the native people, to use them as forced labor, to dig the wealth out of the ground and enrich Belgium, and not do very much for the Congo, what was called the Belgian Congo. And when the Belgians left, forced to leave in the 1960s, there were, by many accounts, 18 college-educated Congolese across this vast territory. They had done almost nothing in 100 years occupying that territory, and left the place very much unready to run its own affairs. And things have not gotten much better since. Has there been a coup-prone set of leaders in the Congo as well?
What we're looking at in Congo is instability and violence are big predictors of whether you might see a coup. So is poverty. But this coup attempt was pretty interesting because it didn't really seem to have a lot of internal support. It's very amateurish feeling. So this seems like a bit of an aberration just because of the nature of what happened. And it doesn't really follow these sort of patterns of what we see in actually successful coups. There were some 50 people involved. It was pretty quickly put down by the Republican Guard and the military. And in a lot of these coup countries, you do see multiple coups. Like, the best predictor of whether there will be a coup in the future is if there's been a coup in the past, whether that's civilian or military, and as well as the professionalism of the military. That's not what happened here.
The Democratic Republic of the Congo was run for a long time by a guy named Mobutu Sese Seko, or as he was christened, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, who was a senior enlisted man. But in one of the coups, this one backed by the United States, he became the strongman of the Congo and ran a cult of personality-laden Congolese government for decades until he died outside the country. Then there were two Kabilas, father and son, and the world didn't seem too upset about any of this as long as the copper and the cobalt and the chromium and the coltan kept on flowing. Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, seems like a very far away place where the writ of the government doesn't run. And in that way, I think Congo has a lot in common with some of these coup-prone states across the coup belt. A bad internal government that doesn't deliver for the people. And yeah, maybe there are diamonds being mined and gold being mined and other precious metals and rare earths heading out of the country, but it doesn't make the people richer, more secure, more educated, doesn't give them better water or help with farming or much of anything.
Right. And I think in other African countries, for example, in Senegal, one of President Faye's one of the things that he's aiming to do is renegotiate those mining contracts so that, and this is also something that Congo's president has said that he would do, was to renegotiate mining contracts with other countries, such as China, for example, which can be extremely exploitative. So these men want to renegotiate these contracts so that more of the wealth comes back to where the environment is perhaps being disrupted or destroyed, where people are being exploited. Like, these are not good places to work a lot of the time. And it's pretty harmful to the environment and to people, but these are also very valuable resources. So in the immediate term, it's a good place to try and make money. But if you have an exploitative mining contract, then you're not going to see a lot of those revenues come back into the country so that you can build it. And then, of course, the other problem is corruption and clientelism. That's a massive problem in a lot of these post-colonial African states. Is you might see revenues flow back in, but they go to the central government, who gives out mining concessions or favors to people he wants to have in his pocket rather than the people.
China has been very aggressive about making friends, building infrastructure, and locking up mining contracts in Africa. Has it really made friends the way we think of allies and friends in modern diplomacy? Or is this really a government to business relationship where, yes, you find out who it is in the capital that whose palm you have to cross or you have to be friendly with, and it never really delivers for the people who live on the land, for instance?
There are a lot of situations I think you'll see where there was an expectation of infrastructure being built, and that hasn't happened. Roads, hospitals, what have you. But these contracts haven't really turned out maybe the way they were originally sold or what the original conception was. But that's definitely not unique to China. I mean, the United States has done that in much more violent contexts. That's what we did in Afghanistan. We made a lot of promises about infrastructure development and didn't deliver. So China is certainly not alone in creating those dynamics.
Have you found, because after all, you're trying to engage an audience, you're trying to stay on this beat, have you found that Africa is a tough sell, that it's hard even for readers who think they're interested in foreign affairs to keep track of what's going on in Africa? Why has Africa just not made the same kind of impression for American news audiences that other parts of the world have? They were just as involved in the Cold War, every bit as involved as Latin America and Asia.
Yeah, I think that's something that people maybe they know about Patrice Lumumba, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't know about Rwanda, but certainly you see it in covering the Gaza war, right? Which deserves a lot of attention, but also the civil war in Sudan deserves a lot of attention too. I mean, people are dying. We don't know how many people have been killed because there's not the kind of infrastructure and data collection that gives us the opportunity to see those numbers like we have in Gaza. So we just don't have that incident. So we don't know how many people have died. We don't know how many people have cholera. We don't know really how many people have been displaced, although it's huge numbers. So we are so lacking in information there. It's pretty appalling. And just in the past couple of days, medical personnel have been forced to evacuate parts of Sudan just because it's so dangerous. And part of the reason we don't know is because we don't care. It feels really far away. We don't have powerful allies in Africa. So I think that's also a part of it. I think Africa is a hugely diverse continent. There are so many different languages spoken. There are different kinds of political structures. So much happening there, but I think it's a bit of a black hole for a lot of Americans, partly because I think we ignore ourselves to violence in certain areas of the world. And we begin to expect that, oh, that's just how it is there, rather than thinking about the events, systems, and situations that created those contexts. Maybe you learned about colonialism in Africa when you were in high school doing world history. Maybe you didn't. And so I think there's just a real lack of foundational education about this huge continent and the people in it and what has happened to the people in it. Right now, I'm writing about elections in South Africa, where the African National Congress has really lost its majority and its kind of stranglehold on power for the first time in 30 years, which is a huge deal. But my question is, how does this affect people in South Africa and their really serious environmental, economic stability needs? And how can a new government address massive inequality that still exists even after apartheid was destroyed? So I try and think about things from the perspective of what's happening to people rather than how does this event concern me personally.
The movement to free markets and free trade and free and fair elections that marked the era after the fall of the Berlin Wall didn't deliver for hundreds of millions of African citizens. And maybe the bloom is off the rose and the thrill is gone, and you just don't want to be so poor. You just don't want to have your kids be in so much danger, either of being made into child soldiers or dying of a disease that $1.75's worth of medicine could help cure. And if somebody promises you they're going to deliver where the last elected president couldn't or didn't or wouldn't, maybe peaceful transfers of power are a wonderful thing to have, but at some point you just say, well, first take care of my real problems.
Right. I certainly think that's part of it. And I also think that so often, for example, in America, we don't think about cholera at all. It's not a disease that really it doesn't have any sort of place. We think of it as maybe like an 18th century disease. Well, there are huge cholera outbreaks all over the world, and they're going to kill children. And it's a horrible way to die. There's no dignity in dying that way. And it would be, with investment into vaccine manufacturing, we could do a lot to prevent those deaths, but it's just not something that is in our face, so we don't think about it. And again, these systems feel really big. It feels like, okay, well, what does corrupt or a non-democratic leader in Africa mean for me? Like, why does that affect me? And I think part of it is also realizing that while there are definitely predictors of coups, or, well, if not predictors, things that lead to possible coup states, it really can happen anywhere. Nowhere is exceptional. We saw on January 6th, 2021, that was a crisis. And no place is immune. You have to invest in your systems. You can't set it and forget it. You have to be really involved and demand that it runs the way we think it should. And, we saw that in Senegal where people are knowledgeable. There's a really vibrant and active civil society that demanded, no, this is not what the Constitution says about how our elections are supposed to go. This is what we want. And we demand this. And it's not going to fly any other way. And the institutions upheld that. And so, it's not a perfect country. It's not a perfect example, but it is an example of democracy really winning the day.
Right. The Senegalese, because of their track record, valued governments that took over from each other after elections because they had been a standout. They had been a star in post-colonial Africa in that regard.
Right. And that's been a process, too. It's not just something that you transition from a colonialist government or a military government and then you have an election and you're a democracy. No, it happens over years and decades. And that institutional trust and those systems are built. And I think we forget that. But a coup can happen. It could happen anywhere. So you do have to be sensitive to the dynamics of how these power transitions operate.
Ellen Ioanes is the world and weekend reporter at Vox. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian and our sister team at the Global Philanthropy Forum. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.